Miami ties with the Bears, and the Chargers destroy the Saints, and we're going to be recapping games from Saturday too, so let's talk sports. Let's talk about it. Finishing up, week one of preseason action has just been a wild ride, guys. I'll just be fully honest with you. Friday was definitely something. There was a lot of games, and then Saturday happened, and there were so many goddamn games on Saturday. And then I even saw on Sunday that we're having games on Sunday. So getting this episode out now is definitely what we need to do. I know I didn't get an episode last Saturday night. There was just a whole bunch of things going on in my own life, guys. Some personal life stuff. And the episode I did put out was very bad. So I just deleted that. And I said, you know what? We're going to talk about these two games today. And then we're going to end off the show going over and recapping all the other games that I watched yesterday for y'all. So guys, if you're new here, if you're my Pandora people, we do sports content every fucking, every time there's a football game, if it's on a Sunday, if it's on a Monday, a Thursday, there's going to be a football episode. So my Pandora people, you make sure you follow. Guys, if you're on Spotify, YouTube, make sure you follow too. So much more sports content coming. I don't know why I said it like that. I said coming. We're not coming, alright? We're talking about sports. Guys, today we had the Miami Dolphins versus the Bears. This is Ben Johnson offense getting ready, and Ben Johnson's team. It's a little, reminder of, what Ben Johnson could be doing this year. I mean, you get to see the schemes. You get to see how, he's calling up these plays, etc. My thoughts about this whole Lions thing with Ben Johnson, the offensive coordinator, going as a head coach to the Bears, and then Aaron Glenn as a defensive coordinator going as, a head coach of his own, which we'll talk about the Jets game too. I'll just say this. I really hope Ben Johnson, really, goes crazy this year. I don't think the Bears are going to be, doing 40 plus or, getting anything, through the NFC this year, but I think, as the years goes on and Ben Johnson gets comfortable, building up his own squad, building up his own team, shit, it could happen, you could get Ben Johnson, absolutely rolling the NFC, but, I wouldn't hold y'all's breath, because, it is the NFC, and also, when you only have a quarterback like, Caleb Williams, and then you got some defensive. They did some defensive stuff, but, that offensive line, guys, is going to just come into question. Is that offensive line going to be able to, keep the defense from killing Caleb Williams? We'll see. Now, there was a few games last year in the NFL that, the Bears actually really stood up to the teams they went against. Even the Lions game was kind of a close game, so they've definitely stayed up this, the test of times, but, is it going to translate into actually winning, actually, doing something, actually bringing something to the table here, actually winning actually winning their division, etc. You're just wondering, what's going to happen. So, I hope the Bears keep improving, keep doing their thing. But this second team we need to talk about before we even get into their game is the Miami Dolphins. What in the fuck is the Miami Dolphins? And, what are the Miami Dolphins, even doing? I mean, it is just quite embarrassing the way the Dolphins have handled, the last, few years. I mean, the 2020 Dolphins it might be one of the worst NFL teams I've seen. They always say the excuses, well, Tuga, this guy, he went on injured. Their quarterback got injured. Well, guess what? Get another fucking quarterback, I'm sure there's somebody else. Improve your offensive line. Maybe get a really good running back so you can actually do something. It's just what are the Dolphins even going to be doing this year? I just feel like the Dolphins are just going to be one of those teams where they're just, getting constantly their ass kicked. Or they're getting a few wins off these really close games. Or they only get wins off of the other shitty teams. It's just it's a constant cycle, and I really wish the Dolphins would just get their head out of their ass and do something. They say that, the coach from the Dolphins, I don't know how this guy's not on the hot seat. I don't know how this guy has not lost his job because he has done nothing but let the Dolphins just crumble. And they're going to continue to crumble. For anybody saying the Dolphins are going to do anything this year, you're just wrong. I mean, let's just be real. The Dolphins do something this year, then that means the NFL talent went fucking down. You know, there's so many better good teams than the Dolphins. I just don't ever imagine the Dolphins really doing something. And this game proves it here. So let's just get into it now. Now, this game was tied up, and if you know with preseason games, you know, you always, if it's a tie, there's no overtime. You know, and I'll be real, guys. You know, for the start off this game, it was kind of the opposite. You know, usually we're talking maybe about the Bears. You know, the Bears are doing decent. Well, no, the Bears were not doing decent in the beginning. In the beginning, the Bears were kind of just there. They were kind of just getting those pregame jitters out the way. You know, they immediately punt. You know, they do 5 plays. They only get 2 yards, so that was definitely disappointing. You know, it's just like, wow, you know. You know, there's a pass incomplete. You know, they try to do this shotgun pass. They have this quarterback T pageant. And, you know, it just feels like every pass the Bears were trying to make just wasn't really hitting. And then, too, like I say, the Bears' offensive line, T Badgett, this guy gets sacked. He gets sacked for 6 yards, you know, and it's just like, wow. You know, and then they make an 8-yard pass, but after you make an 8-yard pass, you know, it's fucking too late. You know, what are you going to do? And, you know, they finally punt it. You know, it's just really, really disappointing to see the offensive line can't even hold up against the Dolphins' second or third string players. You know, like if I'm counting on a second or, you know, third string core, you know, maybe I'm trusting the Bears because the Bears got to have some better players than whatever the fuck the Miami Dolphins are doing. But, you know, the Dolphins, you know, they didn't even do anything better because right off the bat, you know, their 16-play drive, they immediately start with a 5-yard penalty. And then they do a 5-yard run. And you're thinking this 5-yard run, you know, oh shit, okay, here we go, Miami, go crazy. 3-yard pass, okay, a nice little pass, nice little shotgun pass from, you know, Takula. And then, you know, a 4-yard pass from Takula again, and then another 6-yard pass, and then a 6-yard run. But then as you notice, as these things keep happening, you know, there's a pass incomplete. And when you do an incomplete pass, you know, you either turn to the passing game more or you turn to the running game. And the running game, guys, the running game's got to get like 6 or 7 yards. You know, if you just get if you just get, you know, this little, you know, pass incomplete, then a 5-yard pass, you know, it just doesn't make any sense. So you need a big run. And so they do that. The Miami Dolphins, they say, okay, we need a big run. So they get a big run. 11-yard run, which was pretty big. And then a 6-yard run, which was pretty nice in my opinion. And then, you know, the typical Miami Dolphin fashion keeps shining through. A run for no gain, you know, another no gain, and then a easy turnover on downs. You know, it's just like, damn. So, the Miami Dolphins, they don't get a good start either. And then the fucking Bears just come in here, you know, with a 1-yard run. Bad start. A 5-yard pass. Okay, good, but you need to make another pass. But then they get a pass incomplete, and then they have to punt. So, this beginning half of the game, Miami wasn't playing good, and the Bears certainly weren't playing good either. So that was definitely a bad start. You know, offensive line wasn't really handling itself well. Defense wasn't really handling itself well either. You know, it's just like, what the hell are we even goddamn doing? You know, I really wish that, you know, the Bears could have got off with a better start. You know, they could have held up their blocks a little bit better. But, I mean, Miami's got their starters out. And their starters out can't even fucking do anything. So, it's just like, y'all think Miami is going to make a run on the regular season when preseason, you know, you got their quarterback just already flailing their arms, flailing their passes, getting incomplete passes, only doing short passes. You know, it's just like you can only rely on this stuff so much before it just absolutely backfires on you. So, yeah, I mean, Jesus Christ. We're going to get into the offensive performances for the Bears and the defensive performance for the Bears. We'll talk about Miami's side, too, and then we'll give our scores. And we'll move on to another game, guys, because this game's getting depressing to talk about. Because this game did just end up in a tie. So, we don't really know who would win this one. So, yeah, we'll talk about that right after the break. Now, overall, the Bears' offensive side, I would say they were pretty decent. You know, offensive line wasn't the greatest. There was a lot of mistakes, but there was some deep balls. There was some examples of some deep passes, which I did like. But I will say this, though. I definitely did like the Bears' defense. I think the Bears' defense was actually really good this time. You know, the way they were able to get to the line, the aggressiveness they were showing to the other team. It was just beautiful to see, in my opinion. And then you got really good defense, but they're getting these sacks. They're easily getting these turnover on downs. They're easily, once the Dolphins, they do get to the goal line, they got, first and goal. The Bears are not giving up. They're not just going to let the Dolphins just walk in and get a touchdown. The Bears are going to fucking fight to the fullest extent, and you fully see that. So I do like that. Now let's talk about the Miami side. Miami offense, they got some early touchdowns, which I did like. I like the early touchdowns. The Tatula passes were actually pretty good. I liked the short pass game. Now, they were relying on the short pass game, I would say, a little bit too much, especially when, you're making some interceptions or you're making some incomplete passes, it's just not going to translate well when you're just relying on the short pass game over and over and over again. So that's definitely a disappointing side. And, I'd say defense kept the same aggression. They were the same as the Bears. They absolutely came to the line. They were stopping those turnovers. They were trying to get those turnovers. They were letting the Bears go at it for a while, but then they'll eventually stop them and get a pretty easy turnover. So that's really good to see. So, yeah, guys. Overall, if I'm going to rate both of these teams for the offensive and defensive side, Bears are just going to get, a 6 flat. Then Miami's just going to get a 5th flat. They're going to get a 5 flat because I think, their offensive side wasn't as great as the Bears, in my opinion. So, let's move on now, guys, and let's talk about another football game that happened today, which I really, I'll be real, I didn't really enjoy this last game that much. It was the Saints against the Chargers. I liked what the Chargers did. I liked, the way they were, chunking that deep ball, keeping the run game going, keeping the clock down, absolutely sucking time away. I like they were doing that, but, the Saints' performance wasn't that good, and it was just kind of field goals and then, a couple of touchdowns. So this game wasn't my favorite. Rating these two teams, the Saints are just going to easily get, like a 4 out of 10. Chargers are just going to get a 5. No, they'll get a 6 because they won the game at least. Now, let's get into the Saturday clock, guys, because there was a Saturday day of a whole bunch of preseason games, and I do want to go over those preseason games before we get out of here, before we, recap my final thoughts about, week 1 of the preseason of the NFL. So let's start off with, the first game on Saturday. It was the Giants against the Bills. This was the Jackson Dart and, Buffalo Bills showdown with the second and third string. I really like what the Giants did. Really nice touchdowns. I will say this, though. I really liked what, the Giants, they got some field goals. They got some nice punts. But I really liked how they kept the aggression going. They kept the touchdowns going. They kept piling on the Buffaloes. Buffalo's performance wasn't that good in my opinion. Offense wasn't really shining. So if I had to rate both of these teams, Giants are going to get a 7 out of 10, and then Buffalo's probably just going to get like a 4. I really wish their second and third string players would have showed up today, but you didn't really get that. I'll just say that. The next game, we got Houston versus Minnesota. Houston was such a disappointing game. They had like one drive where they got one good touchdown and then a field goal. They got to 10, and then Minnesota just crushed them and kept crushing them throughout the whole entire game. Houston's going to get like a 3. Minnesota wasn't even that good, so I'm just going to give them like a 5. Now, the next game, Pittsburgh versus Jaguars. Pittsburgh got 31. Jags were kind of keeping this game close with 25. I really liked the Jags defense, the way they were coming at the Steelers. But, Steelers did their thing. I don't really like the Steelers that much in my opinion. But I liked what Rudolph did in this game. Some nice touchdowns. And Rudolph overall, had a couple of touchdown passes and stuff like that. So, if you're worried about the Steelers this year, don't be worried too much. But I would be a little worried because, they let the Jags kind of get a little too close. So, rating the Steelers, I'll give them a 6. Jags, probably just a 5. The next game that we had was Dallas Cowboys versus the LA Rams. I really love how the LA Rams completely fucked the Cowboys up. Great to see. Their defense was just absolutely destroying the Cowboys. The offense, from the LA Rams is great. And this was just second and third string players. And, when you got second and third string players from the Dallas Cowboys, you know what you're going to goddamn get. So, 3 out of 10 for the Cowboys, and I'm easily going to be giving a 6 for the LA Rams. Now, let's move on, and let's get into the later slot games. We got, the Cam Ward, and we'll talk about Cam Ward right after the break. Alright, the Tennessee Titans versus the Buccaneers. This was 7-29. The Buccaneers completely fucked the Tennessee Titans. Cam Ward couldn't even do anything. Cam Ward immediately got bomb rushed, easily got sacked. Very disappointing what Cam Ward brought to the table. We'll see if Cam Ward can, he's a rookie, so he's gonna make some mistakes. So hopefully he can, bounce back. Disappointing game. Tennessee Titans are gonna get a 2 out of 10. Buccaneers, though, I really like what the Bucs did, so I'll give them a 6. Now, Chiefs versus the Cardinals, this was 17-20. It was 17-20 for, the whole entire game. The Chiefs, gave up. They didn't want to beat the Cardinals, I guess. Chiefs 4, Cardinals 5. Now, the Jets versus the Green Bay Packers, guys. Guys, I really like what the Jets are cooking with. Aaron Glenn's not going to be, crazy, He's not going to be going insane. But you got Justin Fields. And he actually made a running touchdown play, which was really awesome. So the score was 30-10. I like how the Jets played. They had so much more aggression. The defense was at the line. The Packers were kind of just there. They got a field goal. They got a touchdown. But that was kind of it. The Jets are easily going to get a 7 out of 10, and the Packers are just going to get a fucking 4. And then the final game that night was the Denver Broncos against the 49ers. The Denver Broncos completely fucking destroyed the 49ers. 30-9. It was just laughable. The Denver completely, fucked them over. They just did field goals most of the time, too, Denver was doing. Then they got a couple of touchdowns, but they just kept piling on field goals and just beating the 49ers. Score for the Denver, 6. 49ers, a 3. Guys, overall, my thoughts about preseason of Week 1. I really enjoyed Week 1 of preseason. I'll be putting all these together as, one little, hour-long podcast for y'all if y'all just want to listen to all of my coverage of this whole Week 1 of preseason. We'll be back for Week 2 of preseason. That's going to be really fun. The slot for those games will probably be crazy, and more teams will be comfortable, so hopefully we'll get some more exciting matchups, guys. But that's going to do it for me, guys. Let me know if you enjoyed preseason Week 1 from the NFL. Guys, if you're on Pandora, if you're on YouTube, if you're on Spotify, wherever you get your podcast at, my Pandora people, make sure you follow. So we're dropping new sports content every single week. And I'll see all of you. Have a good one. Bye.